it is extremely important what they've chosen to self-identify as core to who they are. And that's part of what you're trying to discover. And that's part of the way that you respect them. And so I do think that that combined with the fact that these are, ideas that people encounter in the culture, like, it does mean that, yes, this is an important area of focus. Like, you can't understand people if you just eschew all thinking and reflection about these areas.
Yeah, I would echo that. I would just say that the failure to take into consideration aspects of a person's identity would be failing to actually see them as an individual. If you just say, let's just treat people like individuals, I don't know what that means, right? That's just an abstract statement, or it can be an abstract statement. There's also the fact that, at least here in America, and our current reality has emerged out of a certain cultural grammar that has been impacted by many different historical, religious ways of thinking about what it actually means to be an individual. And we're swimming in that cultural grammar, and we can't simply kid ourselves and think that we can dispense with that when we say treat people like individuals. So, for example, what is the relationship between Calvinism? Many of the founding fathers of this country, or people who are certainly escaping religious persecution in Europe, were Calvinists, and they viewed reality in a certain lens and through a certain way, and they viewed themselves through a certain lens, and they viewed aspects or concepts of light and darkness in a certain way, which was imbued with religious language. And that inevitably impacts the way we see human beings, even to this day. Or you could take the example of the fact that also stemming from Calvinism and Protestant ideas in general, there was an association built up within this country between having access to wealth and having access to spiritual salvation, right? This is the cultural grammar in which we are still swimming, and which we conceive of the idea of the individual, to say nothing of Rousseau, who had ideas about the individual that I think we know now are just completely inaccurate, but we still sit with that cultural grammar. So this idea that there's this kind of blank slate, model with which we could approach understanding what it means to treat people like individuals, I think is ultimately flawed. And what we really have to aspire to do, and this is a practice, is to always be aware of the complexity of what it means to be an individual, right? And always be aware that we are, again, to go back to this, to try to combat the splitting concept, or the splitting impulse that we have, right? To always be aware that I as an individual contain multitudes. You as an individual, everyone on this call, including those who are asking questions, contain multitudes and multiple aspects of their identity, right? And so to be able to wrestle with that, relate to that, acknowledge that, and point that out is not an affront to this idea of treating people like individuals, but I think ultimately honors that in the end.
I think I'm of a couple of different minds about this, and I certainly appreciate the question in the sense that it kind of takes us back to the foundational, the root of what brings us to engage in these kinds of discussions. It is the case that if you have an institution, say a school, for example, you have an interest in attracting employees, finding great team members, and you are serving a particular audience. You've got the students, you've got their families, and relationships between and amongst all those people. And the reality is that whatever your institutional perspective on the centrality of an individual's identity, their kind of meaningfulness or lack thereof of racial identity, like, people are going to approach these things in distinct ways. And there's going to be some kind of cultural perspective on diversity that it's necessary to engage with so that you can talk in that shared language that Chloe was just alluding to. In much the same respect, though, I do think it becomes very important for an institution to define its values in a very clear way and to the extent it has its own perspective on diversity that is perhaps very different than the prevailing notion of diversity, then it becomes incredibly important to engage in conversations internally, and perhaps even publicly, and to think about your branding and messaging and the ways in which you can communicate your distinct perspective on something that may in fact be really fundamental to the way that you're able to provide the service that you hope to provide to your families, to do good team building in a way that you think is most fruitful. And the reality is that we can differ from one another in an infinity of ways, but we tend to focus on a couple of specific ways in which we're different from one another. And as Chloe alluded to, I think it does require some practice to figure out how to do that in a more productive way than we've often been able to do it. So I think the only way to develop those muscles is to engage in those discussions and to find the places where you're encountering, say, some friction, and to be able to navigate that stuff by doing and by modeling good behavior. But I also think that again, divorcing ourselves from a lot of the more common ways of engaging in these discussions by refraining from phrasing all of this with respect to, say, racial diversity, for example, and placing the emphasis back on individual diversity. I think it gives us a real opportunity to have more fruitful discussions about these issues and to illustrate the values that we say may want to be able to deliver to people in the context of whatever kind of product or service we're bringing to the market.
Yeah, I would just say before you jump in, Greg, just to directly answer Camille's point, like I think we Higher Ground, Guidepost, ATI, as an organization, have a very substantive view, and that cuts off a lot of things. And the substantive view is that what matters is the individual's developing capacity to make choices, and everything that goes into that. And so I think the point that I was making is that, the context in which that occurs and understanding, especially when you're talking about a developing child or teenager, the range of choices that are permissible, that are quote healthy, in development, I think means and demands a kind of an awareness and a sensitivity to these issues. Whereas with other adults, I think you can legitimately say, people can choose to imbue more or less meaning into, let's say, their race or their gender, and you can have different views. I may have a personal view that people that imbue more meaning and attribute more to that and self-identify that with that more, are less aligned and are less, preferable to me than people that do less, right? Because that's my take on it. I don't think in education that's appropriate for an educator to do with a developing child. I think we're very much focused on the kind of first part of that, which is enabling and empowering the capacity to self-create, and less on less on trying to nudge in specific directions, without denying that there is a range. There are unhealthy, there are things outside the range that are unhealthy.
A few thoughts just I want to add, and some of this is picking up on what Chloe started to talk about. If you say, I just see people as individuals, and then I'm not interested in any of the particular respects in which they differ, or I'm equally interested in all of them, it's not clear what it means then to see them as individuals. Seeing people as individuals isn't magic. It doesn't magically solve every problem, and it doesn't magically just happen if you clear your mind of some prejudice and then suddenly, I see, seeing in general, understanding, knowing in general is something that takes work. You have to learn how to do it. And in particular in education, part of the discipline of Montessori is you have to learn how to observe the child, how to follow the child, how to get a bead on what's going on with this child. And in general, in life, we have to learn how to understand one another, to notice things about one another, to put the things we notice about one another in context so that we're seeing what's important is more important, and discarding or minimizing the things that are less important. Right? That's something that takes work. And it's something that we have to learn to do. And if the right answer to these issues of race and gender and sexual orientation that people are so concerned about today is that we should see them as just some of the traits that people have and not that different from the other ones. And really the way to understand them is by putting them in their, putting them in context of understanding the person as a whole individual. And these are just some facts about them that may or may not be relevant, right? If that's the right approach, which I think it is, that's something one has to learn to do. And one has to learn to do it today in a context where there's a lot of noise about these particular traits and how you should think about these particular traits. So there might be some relevant actual facts about how to think about them, and I'll say something about them. But there's also the fact that we're bombarded with, hey, this one's black, this one's white, this person's gay, this person's cis or trans, and you have to worry about how to, and if you don't think about, well, how am I going to approach that so that it's of a piece with my thinking about other things about them and it doesn't steal the show as to who they are, then you're either going to kind of have this uncomfortable, oh, he just happens to be black and it feels weird to even say it, or he just happens to, or on the other hand, in which case you're treating it the way other people treat it, but you're just being quiet about it and uncomfortable. Or else you're going to say, he's a black man, and this is the most important thing about him, and then you're putting on airs about it. So, like, how do you not do one of those things in a world where the world is pushing you to think about people that way? And so many people around you are categorizing them in one way or else rebelling against that inarticulately. How do you put it all into context? And then the one thing to think about, now picking up on something Ray said, right? Ray talked about, well, you can imbue these things, your race, your sexual orientation, your family's country of origin, whatever, with more or less import. And that's true in your own self-identity. But there's an extra feature of the categories that are talked about today under diversity, race, gender, sexual orientation, a few other things, right? Which is... the response I think a lot of people would give to what Ray said is, yeah, fine, don't think it's important about you, but other people will. The cops will, people giving you a loan will, other people are going to view you this way. And so you can't, even if you don't identify as black or Indian or Canadian or whatever, try telling that to the person at the border. They're going to care who's checking the passport. So what these things have in common is they're categories that matter to how a lot of other people treat you. Other people view them as important, and therefore they're going to have a potentially outsized role in how you're treated. And I think that's what unites the categories that are thought about in DEI kind of situations, that are thought about as, potentially protected minorities on this or that scale, or protected attributes. And what's the wider heading to put these things under? Well, they're features of us that might be accidental, that might not be that important in their own right, but that may have an effect on how we're treated and on what experiences we have. And then what other things in life are there like that you have to think about when appreciating somebody, when trying to figure out what they're about, what they're coming from, what you might need to notice about them. So I would think of a lot of these things are things like, you have a student who's just moved, or an employee who's just moved, right? That's maybe not, some people, that's part of their identity. It's a big, like, I'm the guy who's just come to Austin and I'm going to make a big deal. And the first thing out of my mouth is how I just moved here. And I'm going to make, other people aren't going to make a big deal about that. And that's one important difference among people who've just moved. But there are going to be experiences, potential problems, things that people will have in virtue of having recently moved, that, it might be useful to know about them. And then to think about, like, how big a deal is this? And there are just a million things like that are, someone's likely to have some common experiences in virtue of this trait. And then they're going to process them very differently in virtue of their other traits and the choices they make. And I think we have to think of, think about how to understand race, sexual orientation, sex, etc. In what other traits, what other things you might notice about someone are like them or unlike them in the respects that are relevant to what you're interested in. What experiences you can or cannot assume they've had, what differences there might be among how they would process, even if there's common experiences. What things will they have gotten opportunities to do that other people wouldn't, et cetera. And then there's a kind of process of learning to integrate that into how you view a person.
Yeah, so I just have two quick thoughts to add, which is one of which flows into this question from Julie. So one is that, there's this Baldwin line. I'm kind of paraphrasing it here, that, race is a lie. And that's my view. But I also think that view does not mean it's not like race is a lie, so let's jettison the whole thing and never think about it again. And I don't think that was Baldwin's view. It's a complicated, the lens of race, the category of race, how the kind of folk think of it, how it kind of exists in the culture. It doesn't have any biological reality, but it has effects. And it wraps up and conceptualizes things that are very real, kind of cultural and historical things that do matter, and things that matter to people. And even insofar as it's a lie, it still has effects, and people think about it and engage with it. And it's an outsized lie that hasn't had an outsized effect on the way that we conceive of ourselves as a society. For that takes work to untangle. And it takes work to relate that to whatever your positive view of identity is. And I think it is special work. It's like you're hiking through the Appalachian Trail and you've come across a thicket of thorns. And you could think of that as like, oh, let's like walk around it like it's just hiking. Or you could think about it as like, okay, I've got to stop and solve this problem. That's how I kind of think about this issue. It's that there's a thicket of problems here, and it's going to be tricky to untangle. And it's going to manifest in special ways in our schools. So one way that it manifests, and this gets into Julie's question, is, and this is not at all the only way, but one way is people care about this issue. Staff care about it. Parents care about it. Parents reasonably don't want to send, it's very, so I'm in New York, and it's very common for parents to have the concern, it's a white parent with white kids, and they're like, I don't want to send my kid to some lily white school where there's going to be no diversity, and they're going to be around a bunch of kids that look like them, or maybe there'll be a couple of model minorities. I want genuine human diversity. I want them to get exposure to a range of people who look different, who are from different cultures, who might speak different languages, who have a range of experiences, and race is part of that. Race is part of that conception. So what do you say to that? How do you think about that issue? How do you think about what do you think about that as a school? Do you just think no, we're colorblind, we don't think about that issue? Or do you think that there's a legitimate concern here? And how do you speak to parents about it? That is one very particular, narrow, special problem that I think, just as an example of how do you think about that issue, that having a diversity and inclusion project will help you answer. So this gets me to Julie's question. So Julie asks, I would like to know how diverse is Guidepost as far as students and staff? Maybe Ray, you can say something about this and then I'll say something about it. How diverse is Guidepost as far as students and staff? And is there anything being done to help diversify Montessori education?
Yeah, I would say that our schools tend to reflect the demographics of the communities that they're in. So the ones that are in more communities with more ethnic diversity, you tend to see that at the school, and the ones that are in communities with less, you tend to see that in the school. I think to some of the things that Matt was saying, this is, kind of thinking about diversity is an important value of the organization. Trying to increase the diversity of student body in artificial ways is not a primary focus of the organization. Increasing access to Montessori is a primary focus. How do we get this, how do we, both in terms of how do we get the cost down and how we get this cheaper and how do we bring it to more people, and how do we educate and build bridges to populations that maybe do not understand Montessori. So for example, a simple thing, in African-American communities, the word academic is viewed much more positively when you do surveys. And I don't know how much it maps onto income and kind of socioeconomic class, but than in other communities, right? And it tends, and I think it tends in immigrant communities as well. My guess is that the communities in which we flourish have a certain ambivalence about the view academic. And so if our advertising and if our outreach is assuming, don't just focus on academics, focus on, let's say, like the kind of holistic view, and we're not educating ourselves about how that's going to be interpreted in different communities, we're missing an opportunity to build bridges to people that we want to, children that we want to reach.